and hopefully that's all going now. Okay, so the European Marine Board, this was an organization that we already presented in the sort of meet and greet of the ECOP network. What is the ECOP network? Well, it's for all the early career ocean professionals who are linked to EMB's members. And it's really an opportunity to come together, to meet each other, and have more of an active role in the activities of EMB. It was established, as I said, by the 4 young ambassadors that we've got on this call. So that's Alfredo, Rebecca, Juliet, and Angeli. And we work together with the Secretariat to put together this network and also this series of events that we're just launching. So this is the first edition of that series, but we hope to continue it on a monthly basis on the first Wednesday of every month. And we're looking to get speakers who are sort of engaged in different aspects of the marine science policy landscape, primarily in Europe, but if there are links that are relevant to international activities, then that's something we can look at too. We also, as I said, have this Slack channel for the whole network to speak to each other and to meet each other. If you haven't already joined that, I'll send around some links after this event, and I will also include the link to the Slack channel. So if you haven't already joined it, then you will get that information afterwards. So then moving on to this discussion in particular. So as the first event of the series, it seems sensible to kind of give you an introduction to the European marine science policy landscape. Some of you may be familiar with parts of it, some of you may not be at all. This is to kind of hopefully give us all a general grounding that we know what we're talking about as we move forward with this series. If you do have questions, either make a note of those for the discussion later on, or pop those in the chat and we can go through those later. So I'm Paula Kellett, as I said. I'm a science officer at the European Marine Board. And this is a landscape that we as an organization are quite engaged in. So hence, the reason that we can give this talk. So let's get started. And please don't panic. This image is almost meant to be scary. It's called a horrendogram. And it gives an outline of all the marine related policies, standards, legislations, regulations, both European and international. And it is very complicated and there is a lot to it. And that's kind of the point of this slide. It is complicated. There's a lot going on. There's lots of different people involved. And in fact, this was made in 2014. So there's a good chance that it has got more complicated since then. However, once you start digging into it, you also notice there are, for example, links between these things. So, that policies and directives and initiatives, they don't stand alone. There are links between these things. They are put together in a certain kind of way to try and cover the wide range of topics that is the marine landscape. It's also good to note, I think, for us as researchers, as scientists, we don't need to understand this entire framework. We don't need to know the details of every single thing on there. We only need to think about, perhaps understand, perhaps try to engage with the parts that are specifically related to our expertise, to what we're working on. So although there's a lot going on, nobody is expected to know everything that's going on here. But it is also important to note that all this fragmentation can have downsides. So it can mean that there is perhaps lack of complementarity between some of these things, lack of consistency. And that is something that researchers are working on, policymakers are aware of, and that is being worked on. But it's good to know that there are positives and negatives to this sort of complicated landscape. So dialing down more specifically into the European level. So quite specifically in Europe, we have the European Union, and that's a very influential body, especially in terms of marine. So some policy areas, for example, healthcare, are often set at national level in Europe. So national governments have a very high say in what goes on in that landscape, how it operates, what their strategies and policies will be. However, for marine, it's very much dictated at the European level. And that is quite important for us to be aware of. The EU countries, therefore, the member states that you see here, they have a very direct say in the policy making for marine topics. And the other countries who are not members, they have a less direct say because of the way that this is organized. So the interaction with non-EU countries, for example, the UK, Norway, Switzerland, and there are many others, that is really on a case-by-case basis. There's not a global picture of how different non-EU countries engage in Europe's marine activities. Some will comply with the EU regulations, some will engage in funded projects that are linked to marine. Some, it's very varied. But this European Union unit has a huge say in how marine policy works. And this unit also has quite a say in international level. So along with member states having a voice at international level, the European Union as a body also has a say in international level. And again, for things like marine, that can be quite influential, that a representation of an entire continent has a particular viewpoint about things, how things should be done on a marine topic, and that can be quite influential at international level. So if we're in this European Union, then who are the people that are making these policies? Who is engaged? Who do we need to be thinking about? So that I'll start down here. Very first one is the European Commission. So I think most people on this call will be aware of the European Commission. But what do they actually do? So they're known as an executive group. They're not elected. They are workers as you and I. They're not linked to any specific government or so on. And they, which we'll talk about later, are divided up into different directorate generals which focus on different topics. And we'll dive into that a bit more in a while. The European Commission in the policymaking scheme are the ones that actually propose new policies, new strategies, new regulations. And they do that using the scientific knowledge that already exists. They are very keen to build on solid foundations of scientific knowledge and information in order to build their proposals. In their proposals, they can also say what kind of instruments they expect it to be. So I'm not going to go into detail now because it's a topic in itself, but there's a wide range of different types of instruments that can be used in policy. So it could be more in the level of recommendations, it could be legally binding requirements, it could be somewhere in between, it could be a strategy, it could be guidance. So again, the European Commission will use the existing knowledge and perhaps engagement with stakeholders during the development process to really determine what would be the most appropriate instrument. And as I say, they engage with other people in making these proposals. This is not something they do in isolation. They will speak to specialists and experts. They will engage with the public. And depending on the topic, they might go through quite a few rounds of sort of asking other people what their feelings are, what their thoughts are in developing that recommendation. Then there are two other important decision-making bodies in Europe. So that's the European Parliament and the European Council. And both of those bodies have to approve any policy before it goes into force. So both the nature of the policy, what type of instrument it is, but also the requirements that it places on the member states. So all three of those groups have to agree on something before it comes into force. As an example of how that process works, so you might have heard this discussion of the suggestion that we stop changing between summer and winter time and just stick with one time throughout the year. That was a proposal that the European Commission made. They gave this proposal to the European Parliament and the European Council. The European Parliament approved it. They said that works, that makes sense for us. But the European Council came back to the European Commission and said, actually, we're not sure if we've got enough information to make this decision. We don't know what the impact is going to be on our economies, on our workforce, and so on. So we can't approve it right now. We would like you to go back and get some more information to back up your proposal. And so there's sort of a back and forth iterative process between these three bodies before something is approved. So who are these two groups? Well, the European Parliament is a group of elected members of European Parliament, MEPs, and they represent the different EU member states. And the amount of MEPs they have depends on the population of that country. So it's balanced in that way. They are not able to propose policies of their own. That's only something the European Commission can do, but they do need to provide this agreement on different topics. And as I say, they are elected, so they're nationally elected. You and I can vote in national elections to elect who represents us at European level. And then we also have European Council, and I should say that we should not confuse them with the Council of Europe. It's very similar sounding, but they're not the same. So the European Council here, who is the important decision body for the European Union, they are the heads of state of the EU member countries, so presidents, prime ministers, so on. However, the Council of Europe, who are based in Strasbourg, they're an international organization mostly focusing on human rights issues, and they represent all European countries, so all 46, and not just those in the EU. So we're not talking about the human rights people, we're talking about the heads of state of EU member countries. So you may have heard of this, the European Council presidency. It rotates every 6 months, and whichever country has the presidency for those 6 months, they can highlight topics that they feel are particularly important to them. They can have events that, again, of areas of importance for them. And at the moment, where we've just switched between French presidency, so that was till the end of June, and the Czech Republic is just taking over, and each of the member states take it in turns to have this presidency. So all the marine policies that need to come into force need to have this agreement between these three bodies. And as you can imagine, that can be quite difficult. There's lots of different agendas going on in this discussion. So it can be difficult, it can be time consuming to get these agreements, and it's certainly not an easy process to engage in. National governments who sit at the top here, they're of course run in slightly different ways in each country, and they don't have direct influence, as it were. But again, they're elected by the population, and that can influence who is then in the European Council, so who ends up as the head of state. Sorry, could you, oh, thank you, muted. So they can, they have an indirect say still, and therefore, again, national level elections where you and I are able to elect who represents us in the national level, and that can again have an influence if we have, people who have marine issues very close to their heart, then that may influence what happens further up. Same with policy making, I should note that also setting of budgets, it works in the same way in the EU. So with the European Commission making a recommendation and the Parliament and the Council having to agree to those. And that includes the European Commission research budget. So for example, the Horizon Europe programme. And as you can imagine, the national governments do have quite a say in that, because the money for those budgets is coming from the national governments, and the European Council is the representation of those national governments. So having their agreement can be quite difficult, and they tend to be possibly more realistic in what they think should be spent on research compared to the European Parliament, who can afford to be more idealistic. But that's an overview of kind of how it works generally in Europe. I can't say anything on different international levels. This is how it works in this particular case. So if we then go into more detail on the European Commission, So the European Commission is led by a president, currently Ursula von der Leyen, who is from Germany. And in fact, you will see there are 27 different faces on this chart. And that just happens to correspond to the 27 EU member states. So essentially, each EU member state has one commissioner from that country. They're given a specific portfolio, so you can see the titles here. Often they will link to a Directorate General within the European Commission itself, but that is not always the case. These people are selected at a national level, but not elected, and they serve a 5-year term. So all of them work together, in this case, from 2019 to 2024. Then there's a new election and a new group of commissioners will come in and be assigned their portfolios. So I've highlighted in orange a couple of different topics here that have some relationship to marine. So marine is not housed just in one specific Directorate General. It's covered by many, and I'll highlight those. So the most important, of course, is environment, oceans and fisheries. So this is Virginia Sinkevičius down here. He's from Lithuania and he is the commissioner of both the Directorate General for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries, but also for the environment. So that's a lot of where the marine activity is housed, but it's not the only place. So down here, we also have Kadri Simpson, who is from DG Energy. So that also has marine relations. Adina Valian here from Transport, Stella Kyriakis for Health and Food Safety. And they also have some relationship to marine topics and some aspects might be covered under their portfolios. And then we also have Maria Gabriel here, who's from Bulgaria, and she covers research and innovation and also the European Commission's own research arm, the Joint Research Centre. So a lot of the research programs that cover marine topics are covered under her portfolios and those directorates. And then there are some areas which cover everybody. So for example, you have Frans Timmermans up here who heads up the European Green Deal, but that is a topic that is, EU-wide. That covers all the topics, all of the Commissioner's activities. So it's not just split by topics, there are some overarching activities as well. As I said, these, so in DG Environment, just to give you a few differences there, they tend to deal more with the ocean and nature in itself. Whereas, for example, DG MARE deals with human activities in the ocean, how people engage with the ocean. So they don't overlap in their activities, but in a way they're complementary between the different topics that they cover. And as I said, as well as proposing policies and managing the environment in itself, the Commission also funds research and conducts its own research, and that's based up here with Maria Gabriel. So there's a wide range of activities that they cover. The fact that marine is split between different areas can be both a positive and a negative. It's same with the nature of the complicated space to begin with. It means that there's different people who have an interest in looking after the ocean and supporting ocean activities, but it could potentially also mean that things slip between the gaps where it's not clear whose jurisdiction it really is. And it's just something to be aware of. The system works and it continues. So we just have to be aware of those possibilities. So if I go on now in more detail, so looking as an example, this is the sort of charts that you get for all of the Directorate Generals. And this is specifically for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries. So at the top here, we have, again, the Commissioner, and then we have a Director General that works under them. And then you can see they then split into these different sub-levels of different topics, which each then have their own unit, which dives down again into different topics. So it's becoming more and more focused on specific areas as you go further down the organizational chart. So this is Maritime Affairs and Fisheries, which means all of these areas have a marine relation. But for example, DG Environment also has one of these units who specifically deals with MSFD issues and the ocean. And you have within research and innovation, you also have the Healthy Oceans and Seas unit. And they very specifically deal with Horizon calls, the funding calls, research, and the Mission Ocean initiative as well. So again, everyone has their own areas, and as you go further down the line, the more detail people are looking for. The Director Generals are not elected, and they're not renewed necessarily every 5 years, but Commission representatives are encouraged to sort of move around the organisation and have experience in different topics. So it's not set in stone that these people will stay here forever. There is a reasonable amount of movement. And then if we just focus in on one specific unit as an example. So if we look here, we've got the Commissioner, then we've got the Director General. Then if we go to Strand A, which is Maritime Policy and Blue Economy, and we have someone who heads up that strand, then we go to a specific unit. So in this case, A3, which is Blue Economy, Sectors, Aquaculture and MSP. And that's headed up by a head of unit, Felix Leinemann. And then under him are around 15 to 20 people, depending on the unit, in various roles and specializations on topics related to that. So for us engaging in these units, it really depends on which level we're engaging in to what kind of information we need to provide. Higher up, it's more the headlines. As you go further down, you really do need more details to influence the policy decisions, the research processes, and so on. All this information on who is in which unit, how they're put together, is available online. And there's a page called EU Who Is Who can, if you have a name, you can find out which unit they are in, or if you have a unit, you can find out who works in it, and so on. And again, I'll provide that link in the email that I sent after the event, because it is a really useful resource for kind of figuring who's who and where they belong. So we as European Marine Board, and also of course yourselves as researchers and people active in the marine space, how can we engage with the European Commission? What can we do? Well, quite a number of things. So first of all, as I said, the European Commission uses scientific knowledge, scientific evidence to build their decision making, to inform their policies. So developing and sharing that is a very important part of what we do. And it's very important for them. The Commission has this arm that does research, but compared to the size of the Commission and the topics they need to cover, that is not nearly going to be enough. That they very much depend on the research community for that information. So all of us are already playing a role by doing that. A next step from that is then making that research and those policy recommendations available, accessible, providing it to the right people in the right level of detail. And quite often it's important to highlight the policy relevance. So if we are interested in presenting our work to policy, then it's important that we also consider making it clear why this is important, where it might apply, and so on. As you saw in the unit before, you've got 15 people dealing with that wide topic of blue economy and MSP and aquaculture. That's a lot of topics for 15 people to deal with. So the more direct, the more specific we can be, the more useful that information is. And it's very much a case of us taking the information to those people. We can't expect them to trawl the entire internet the entire time to find that information. They will have people they work with, but it's also important for us to take that and bring that information forward. What else can we do? We can engage with the activities that the European Commission has. And at the moment is very specific things like the Mission Ocean initiative, which is all about bringing not just research, but very much the entire society into engaging with the oceans more directly. We also have initiatives such as EU4Ocean, which is looking at ocean literacy in Europe and building up that competence and engaging society through that. So we can also engage with the Commission specifically in these ways. Often scientists will be engaged as experts to advisory bodies and groups that have been set up perhaps as national expert representatives on a given topic, and as a sort of ongoing advice process to the European Commission. We can, of course, participate in the many different types of funded projects that are ongoing. So there was Horizon 2020, we're now in Horizon Europe, but there's also other funds, the Maritime and Fisheries Fund, there's the Maria Skłodowska-Curie Actions, which are very much focused on doctoral training. So there's a huge amount of different funded options available there. And in a more sort of personal way almost, we can also engage, for example, through public consultations. So something that the European Commission does do on quite a regular basis is publish public consultations or requests for more information on a specific topic. So if they're looking to develop a policy on, say, ocean observations, they might put out a public consultation to ask citizens, experts, national governments, what their thoughts are, what their ideas are, what they feel is required. And that's quite often a several step process. So there might be an initial request just for general input. Then there might be a survey further on looking at more specific details to help inform the choices they make. And anyone is able to provide their input. That can be done either anonymously or with your name on it. And again, I'll include that link in the email, because it is good to know what's going on and to be able to engage in those processes. And then finally, getting to know the policymakers is an option as well. You know, they're people such as you and I, you know, they go to events, they engage on social media and so on. And it's always a nice option to have that sort of personal engagement with people within a professional setting. And that is always an option that we can engage in as well. So in a similar way, how could we engage with the European Parliament? So that is these sort of nationally elected members of Parliament, MEPs, who represent the country and who are renewed every 5 years. Well, the first thing we can do is actually engage in voting in our own countries for who these MEPs are going to be. That's a very active thing that we can do. Experts might again be invited to present evidence to parliamentary committees, and these committees are charged with deciding what their opinion is on a certain topic, on a certain proposal. So it's not that all of the MEPs have to discuss all of the topics, because that would be very ineffective. So there are specific committees, for example, PESH, who covers fisheries, ENVI, who covers environment topics, and they also look for input from experts. There is an option if you choose to lobby your own national MEPs. So if there is a big vote coming on a particular topic, on a particular policy, and they're trying to make the position of the European Parliament as a decision on that, then there is an opportunity to engage with your MEPs and try and discuss what you feel would be important with them. And there are also parliamentary intergroups. So the parliamentary committees are official bodies, they have decision-making power. The intergroups are non-formal, they don't have a power as such, but they do bring together members of parliament who have a joint interest, something that they feel passionately about. For example, CERECA, so that's all the members of parliament who have interests in inland waters, rivers, the sea, the ocean. And they all come together to discuss these topics and then try to take key messages on to the wider groups of MEPs that they have discussions with. So they sometimes organize events and so on. And we can again engage directly with those MEPs via these interest groups, as it were. And again, we can get to know our MEPs, you know, again, they do have time that they spend in Brussels at the European Parliament. They do spend some time in Strasbourg in different sittings of the European Parliament, but they also spend time in their own constituencies in their own countries. And again, some of them are on social media. So there are ways of engaging with our MEPs on particular topics. So we've now been able to engage with our people. So how does this now take us forward? Again, this is just a figure to give you an idea of how these policies are supposed to link together. So this is just a small representation of some of those. The idea is that they're complementary. So different policies will either address different areas of of the ocean, or they will address different specific topics, and they should integrate. Sometimes there can be difficulties with that because of the way that these policies are developed. They didn't all come into being all at the same time. They've grown and developed over the time frame that the EU has been a body, and therefore sometimes you will unfortunately find lack of complementarity or two that kind of counteract each other. The Commission is, this is something they're aware of, that they do work to address this. But given the long time frames and the difficulty in gaining agreement on some of these strategies, then perhaps in some cases they feel it's best to leave it as it is, rather than reopen a discussion that could end up with a worse outcome than before. So it's sort of a work in progress. It's also important to note this 12 nautical miles note here. So all of the EU strategies, directives, policies, the things that EU countries do, that only holds in their own national waters. In international waters, these regulations don't hold. And so then it's very important for the EU to work on an international level and try and encourage other countries to also take on similar ideas and work in similar ways. But it's also important to work on, for example, a regional scale in areas where EU waters border on other countries. So for example, in the Mediterranean, then you have EU countries and non-EU countries working on the same body of water. And, pollution flows, noise flows, things flow through the water without stopping at those national boundaries. So it's very important to work in those regional areas as well and try and get some agreement on how to look after the ocean environment in a collaborative way, even where those regulations don't strictly apply to those non-EU countries. So I'm coming towards the end now, but I have just 2 more slides for you. So the first one is, who are these people then working on this interface? We were very used to seeing this idea of a policy funding research interface in marine science. But more recently, I think we've all come to realize the important role that society also plays in this discussion about how we should protect our seas, how we should protect the ocean. That comes through, even from the beginning, as we've seen, this society can elect people who are representing their countries, who then have a say at EU level. Society can engage in these consultations, for example. We can all engage together. So it makes sense that society is also considered in this interface. So who are some of these organizations? Well, for example, if you're looking somewhere between the research and the policy, you have us, the European Marine Board, but you also have more thematic areas. So for example, ECRA works on climate research in a similar role. ICES works on fisheries in a similar role, as does IFADO. And then you also have more general advice from European academies generally. So ESAC and SACIA are more overarching and not topic specific, but that gives you an idea of the kind of organizations. And this is definitely not comprehensive. There are many, many missing here. This is just to give you an example. Then on the sort of funding policy side, so you have organizations like JPI Oceans who sit between the national ministries providing research funds and the European level policy, so they can kind of provide advice on that level and also fund research on that level. And there's 2 other similar organizations to them, so focusing on water and climate also in that space. I'm sure some of you will have heard of some of these organizations, but not all of them. Again, we don't expect you to be aware of all these people or what they do, but it's just maybe it'll spark a few ideas if you see some of these organizations here. So for example, sitting more between research and funding, you have Euromarine and various co-funds. More between research and society is perhaps the Euro-Ocean Foundation, who work quite a lot now on ocean literacy, and people like the European Citizen Science Association, who very much engage with the public on a wide range of science topics, not specifically marine. And then in that society policy space, I think you more often find the NGO side. So that can be, for example, the WWF and Surfrider, who very much engage directly with citizens. But it could also be someone like Europesh, who represent the fisheries industry at European level. So this was really just to give you an idea of what's going on in that space, and some of those people might be familiar. And again, there is a lot of people working in this space, but you'll see that they each have their own niches. There are some overlaps, there are some synergies, but everyone has their own thing that they focus on, that they do and that they work on in this complex space, and it works. And this is how we continue. And through these organizations, there's also obviously different ways to engage in that science policy landscape. We don't need to engage with all of these organizations. We don't need to engage with any if that's not what you're interested in. But there are lots of opportunities in different aspects, should that be something that you're interested in.